international instrument which promotes human rights and fundamental freedoms as a prerequisite for the creation and the production, distribution, and enjoyment of cultural expressions in all their diverse forms. I have really the privilege to moderate today's panel because I'm here with agents of change. I know we all talk about agents of change, but every single person on this panel today has brought us actually here. And especially our first keynote speaker, Ms. Farida Shahid, who was the former special rapporteur on cultural rights, who wrote the quintessential document for us on artistic freedom and creativity, which gave us at UNESCO the possibility, the legitimacy to talk about artistic freedom in the sense of the convention, of also the recommendation on the status of artists, which had never been discussed before. So it's really my great honor to introduce our first and central agent of change on the panel this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on, or do we have to put it on?
You just talk.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful film. So, as the Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights at the UN, one of my tasks and challenges was to try and get people to understand what cultural rights are as human rights. And in that sense, artistic freedom and creativity, I look at from the perspective of cultural rights as a whole. And for that, you have to understand that culture is a constantly changing process. It's not something static. And therefore, it's always a site of contestation and contested meanings. That's necessary. And also that long before we had social scientists and economists and reporters, we had poets and writers and painters and musicians who would not only give us a sense of what their patrons wanted to hear, the good, but they would find ways to challenge the accepted norms, to bring in new ideas and creativity. And I think that's one of the greatest attractions of artistic creativity, is that it calls upon our emotional and spiritual sense as well as an intellectual response. And that, I guess, is why people find it is dangerous from wherever the perspective is. I have spent a lot of these years since writing the report talking about how we have to understand that art and culture are not luxuries. Art and artistic expressions are an essential and inherent part of how people express their humanity. And also to underline that whenever we try and constrain that creativity, when we try and control it, restrict it, imprison it, or kill creativity, we are killing a little bit of our humanity. We're impoverishing the humanity that we have around us. I think, just to emphasize, that the rights, cultural, artistic freedom, is a right which is enshrined in several international human rights instruments, and especially in Article 15.3 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which talks about, and I love this expression, the freedom indispensable for creative activity. Indispensable, that freedom is absolutely essential. It's also as part of Article 19.2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says that freedom of expression includes the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds in the form of art, including in the form of art. Artistic creation is also contained in Articles 31 and 13 of the Child's Rights Convention. And so the 2005 Convention of UNESCO is just one of a plethora of international standards and international covenants and treaties that demand that we respect and promote artistic creativity. From the perspective of human rights, of course, artistic creativity cannot be limited to artists. So I just want to stress that before I get to artists, that to be a human right, it must be enjoyed by all people. So everyone has the right. And what does this mean? It means in the same way that cultural rights means the right to access, to take part in, and to contribute to cultural life, so too must that apply to artistic creativity. And of course, the restrictions on artistic freedom are not limited to artists. They include everyone who is in the industries of production, in distribution. It includes curators. It includes organizers. It includes the audiences who may go and want to see something and who are therefore attacked. And so I guess it's not just about artists, and it's not just about freedom of expression, which is often something that people think it's only freedom of expression. It includes things which are not really freedom of expression. It includes issues of visas and mobility and work permits. It includes art education. It includes where do you get funding? If it is a human right to be artistically creative, then you must have the wherewithal and the opportunities. And so that means art education. And it means livelihood options. So that means also looking at labor laws, looking at the right to association, etc. But of course, there is the issue of artists themselves. And one of the issues there is that the vulnerability with reporters, the fact that they have to and must engage with the public. And that is, like human rights defenders, but like media people, they are in front of the public, and that makes them vulnerable. Artistic freedom, I think, looking at artistic freedom, it's related to a whole plethora of other rights which need to be looked at, which is, for instance, the right of association, peaceful assembly, the right to freedom of opinion, of thought and conscience and religion. So I've been asked also to talk about how to protect artists. One of the questions there is, how do we know who is an artist? And how do we know who is at risk? And I think these are questions that we need to ask ourselves. The rules and regulations, I think, as I said, are very often we focus, when we talk about artistic freedoms, we talk about censorship. We think of censorship as political and socially motivated. Can I assure you that I was completely shocked at the multiple ways and actors involved in suppressing artistic creativity and artistic rights. So we think, of course, of actors who may be part of the political spectrum, the religious actors, the social actors. Can I emphasize that many artists talk about market censorship? And this is something which is not talked about as much as it should be. So while we are recognizing artists as a vulnerable group and the need to protect them, I think we need to look also at the creative industries. And when you have monopolies or oligarchies, I mean, I fear that people like Kafka and others would never have gotten published if we had today's publishing houses. Independent authors, independent bookstores, these are things which I think we need to look at. I'm also deeply concerned about other laws which relate to public spaces. We have so much contradiction here where you have commercial advertising is permitted. And there often a huge difference between how artists, like graffiti artists, for instance, are treated, where you have countries which have call-in centers where within 15 minutes you will get that artist picked up and thrown into jail, but nobody has the same things for illegal advertising. So are we thinking about the different ways in which artistic freedom is restricted? I know I don't have very much time, and I can talk forever on the subject, but I do want to point out one of the other areas which is not looked at sufficiently, which is copyright. So when artists are there, one of the issues that I've taken up is the question of copyright. Artists usually don't hold the rights very often to their own work. They have contracted that out, and therefore I've looked at that issue that you really do need to look at protecting artists in terms of contracts that they may come into and ensuring that they have a right, both moral and material, and it's the moral right that I often think is forgotten in this. And we need to look at exceptions and how do we make things work better for artists. There's due diligence also called for by the state, because artists are often under attack not because of the state's regulations, but because of non-state actors who may be threatening them, who may be threatening their audiences, may be attacking their work in public. We need to have artists as part of the decision-making and policy-making, and I don't see that happening. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights is very, very clear that participation is Article number 1. So decision-making, who is making the policies? And if we come to the UNESCO Convention, and I would really recommend that everyone looks at this report. I think there's excellent guidelines in how to go forward with the convention. We have here, it's given very clearly, the UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of artists. You know, it's 1980. It's taken us almost half a decade to understand how important that is. So we've made progress, yes, but I do think those recommendations need to be much better known across the world. They need to be spoken about. They need to be reproduced. And in terms of the how do we monitor the convention, Daniela had asked me to talk about it, but I think you have the guidelines here. It says we need to monitor the violations. So we need to defend artists' rights, we need to support the artists, and we need to enforce legislation that is a human rights-based approach. So I think that in terms of monitoring, you can only monitor what you know to be a right. And I think so few people know about the convention. Very few people know about the implications for artistic freedom. I think when I wrote my report, it was the first time that artists thought the UN is a space that they can come to. And I think the UN representatives were really quite surprised also. This was an overlooked area of how important art is. There are mechanisms. There's a UNESCO mechanism for complaints, which I think is not used sufficiently, is not known sufficiently. However, there are also complaint mechanisms under the international, all those who are states parties to the economic, social, cultural rights and to the civil and political rights have reporting periods. You have the Universal Periodic Review. These are mechanisms for complaining, for highlighting the issue of artists and artistic creativity and freedom that we do know exist. In terms of defending artists, I think one of the things is that you do need to have groups that are monitoring. You need to have groups that are educating people about this and working with them. They need to be supported. And just to finish up, because I know we don't have much time, two things I want to highlight. As a special rapporteur to the UN, one of the things that I emphasized in my country visits, but also in the annual reports, is that these are reports and these are tools that have to be used by people locally. So you can make the reports and make the recommendations, but until civil society, academics, media people do not pick this up, it does not become a part of our everyday narrative, we are not going to have the monitoring and the appropriate actions taken that we have. And I think one of the things is that all of us have a responsibility. I would say that in terms of reporting, it seems that there's an increased reporting around cultural rights in general and artistic freedom in particular, which I'm really happy about. But I think for states, it's really useful to have very specific guidelines and questions. And I don't want to go, I have a huge list of questions that need to be asked, but people can go to the report. And I would suggest that in addition to artistic freedom, the other two important reports are on advertising and copyright, which need to be looked at in terms of the rights of artists and the creativity that all of us should have access to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farida, for this very inspiring speech and the call to action from all of us to facilitate change, become agents of change. You're saying that human rights or artistic freedom as a human right is for all of us, not just for artists. And this is something that we've been inspired by in our work at UNESCO, to define a program of work for the future, which is based on all of these different aspects that you've talked about: mobility, economic rights, labor rights. You're right, we haven't touched on advertising rights yet, but that's something that we'll definitely think about. And we'll take up your message for the complaints mechanism to be used more. And that's also a call to action for everybody here to use the tools that exist, whether it be monitoring reports or actually spaces where various voices can be heard. You've raised a lot of questions, so what we wanted to do is to, instead of have presentations, use all of the challenging messages to invite comments and dialogue with our panelists here. Maybe we can go first to Sarah, who again is our agent of change number 2, who is former deputy director of PEN International and has been working together with UNESCO to monitor artistic freedom and the tools that Farida mentioned. So Sarah, what would you say in response to what Farida has said, that in fact artistic expression is to be understood as part of this wider system of human rights? She mentioned many different international laws, but you've been working with journalists, with writers, and to see how we can expand beyond our little silo of just talking about artistic freedom, for that everybody to understand it is part of the wider human rights field.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Danielle. One of the things that struck me from Farida's brief presentation there is that although the concept, the idea of freedom of artistic expression had been in the air, had been floating around since at least 1990, if not before, that the monitoring and the advocacy for artistic expression is very new. Not so much in the case, for instance, of PEN International works for writers, and that has been working for a number of decades on this, but it has been solely working for writers and with a tendency to work alongside journalists and to use the same strategies and the same mechanisms that journalists have used. So it's only really been in the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years when we've started to really regularly monitor, and as Farida said, it's important for us to know who it is who is at risk. And we really are at the very early stages of finding out that, of the monitoring. So if you have a look at the lovely leaflet that's on your tables here, you will see that there is information on the extent of artistic violations in 2016. And this is based on some excellent reporting done by our colleagues in Free News and Artists at Risk. Last year, there were recorded 840 instances of censorship. I would say that is the extent of the limits of our knowledge. It's only what we know about. As we said earlier, monitoring is very inconsistent and not complete. Among them are persecutions and threats, imprisonments. There were 3 killings in that year. So the offences have been carried out by governments, by militants, by extremists, by other state actors. The kind of works that have attracted this kind of persecution has ranged from commentary on politics, on politicians, on the conflicts on minority issues, on women's, LGBTs and other rights, on religion and traditions. So the kind of offences that have attracted this kind of reaction are actually very familiar to the many journalists who are meeting here as well. And also I'd say that the same type of legislation have been applied: anti-terror laws, insult laws, blasphemy laws. So I think what's needed to be done is to look at the success of the media monitoring, the media advocacy, and to see how it can apply to and be used by the artistic community. But first and foremost, though, it's also become apparent to me that the artists themselves don't know what their rights are, whether it is the protections that are at home or internationally. And certainly the governments don't know what their rights are. And also that the public and the audiences, the consumers of the arts themselves, don't know about the concepts of artistic freedom. So there's a lot of work to be done, even though, as you say, we've been starting in decades. It's kind of interesting to see that it's taken off now. And I'd actually like to commend Farida Shahid, because I think your report in, 2013, was it? Really pulled together all those strands and really, really kicked off and elevated the work that some of us were trying to do to get this better known. So thank you very much, Farida.
Thank you, Sarah. One thing that you mentioned about artists at risk, and one of the issues that we've been looking at UNESCO and also in the context of this panel, which is called Artistic Freedom, a Public Policy Challenge, is how can the UN, governments, and others address this question of artists at risk? What action can we take? And we know that in some contexts, the governments have been, especially from the Nordic countries, introducing safe havens, safe cities, and so on. And in the current conflicts that we see around the world, this safe haven network is going to probably burst at the seams. And so what else can be done? And we have our third agent of change here, Khadija El-Banoui, who has been working for Arts Moves Africa, but is in fact an international agent of change working for artists, and I think has some interesting information to share with us about what's happening in terms of dealing with artists at risk today. Thank you, Khadija.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. So it's interesting that you raised that, Danielle, because what we are witnessing now with the current affairs in the world, that there is a huge crackdown on artists as a civil society activists, and that doesn't include only the classical authoritarian regimes attacking the artists in the countries, but also includes the conflicts that are ravaging now huge regions, like, for example, the Middle East, that resulted in crisis of refugees, where we witness also that it influenced the artistic scene, but also the heritage, as we see in Syria and Afghanistan, for example. And there are examples of solidarity, especially from the civil society organizations, and also from some member states in the global north. And it's really amazing to see how the civil society sector is creative and inventive in creating mechanisms and improvising to respond to the needs and to the problems, even though sometimes the tools are not there, the funding is not there. So it's and that's what makes really the sector of the arts interesting. So, for example, I can mention the case of Syrian artists, where we see, unfortunately, that with the war, we suddenly have access to huge creativity, and there is an explosion of artistic works from Syria, and who are based in different European cities, especially in Paris and Berlin, but who face a big problem, one, to access funding, but second, especially to move and present their work. And I would like to mention in this sense the work of Zone Franche in France, that is now 2 weeks ago, made a conference to document and make a state of the art of the situation of artists in exile, especially in France, to see how they can support them and also design advocacy work. Now, as we speak, the theater program of Sundance Institute in New York, who was supposed to develop the program in North Africa and Middle East, but was faced with the issue of visa, is organizing now a focused workshop for Syrian dramaturge in Berlin. So it's, I mean, in the artistic sector, there is, I mean, continuous improvisation and creativity to respond, but the state instruments and state support is still a very big challenge. Thank you.
Sorry, just in my privilege as moderator here, just a quick follow-up question, Khadija. This would also affect the capacity for these artists in exile to access funding, because when you want to make a funding application, you have to have an address, you have to have a legal status. So I would imagine that these artist associations, civil society organizations, and others are helping to overcome that barrier, but that's something also for governments or for other agencies in a position to provide funding to think about, no?
Yeah, and it's not only needing an address and have a status, there are more draconian conditions to access funding that requires conditions of residency for many years for foreigners, and also having some skills, organizational skills. And we know that in the funding system in the global north is, I mean, quite complicated for artists from the global south. And also the language skills that many funding agencies, they require that we apply in their own language, be it German, Dutch, or...
Well, we are very quickly understanding that artistic freedom is a complexity of issues that range from the freedom to create to funding possibilities. And Frida had mentioned in her opening remarks about the role of legislation, not only at the international level, but also that national and local level authorities need to have the tools to be able to enact different types of legislation, including a type of copyright that would benefit the artist. And we have here a small quote from your report that calls upon the member states of the UN to critically review their legislation and practices that impose restrictions on the right of freedom of artistic expression and creativity. Now we have, I'm happy to introduce our agent of change number 4, that's Mr. Farid, who in fact is an agent of change right here in his country, who has introduced, after 30 years, the very first cultural policy. He managed to break this through in Indonesia, and to also be able to address the question of the rights of artists and others that Frida mentioned earlier. So I pass the microphone on to you, Mr. Farid.
Thank you. Let me start by going back quickly to that film that we just saw. I think it's a very excellent film, so congratulations to you. It reminded me very much of a very dear friend of mine, Vijay Tukul. He was a poet. He was disappeared in 97 or 98, around that time. But the story is precisely interesting because it addresses like two aspects or two dimensions of freedom that we are talking about. First is freedom from repression, fear and all that, but then also the question of what can an artist do once you gain that freedom. So now we are relatively better in terms of state repression, authoritarian control and all that, but in the sense of the fate of the artist, their living conditions and all the right that they have to access for funding and etc. is still very much an issue, and that's actually what my office is doing, to grant and also ensure that artists have better access to funding and also to think about their social and economic rights as artists. And the law that we just passed this actually several weeks ago is about that. It's not so much on freedom of expression in general, because there was a human rights law in 1999 and several other laws. Press law was also introduced back in 1990, 1 year after the change of the authoritarian regime. So, but still we have problems and challenges when it comes to repression, not by state actors, but non-state actors, and I think it's a global trend now. Religious orthodoxy is on the rise, like everywhere, including in Indonesia, and this has been very huge problem. And I think with the last governor election here, probably some of you are aware of that, it has become even worse. So still we need to address that, and one of the measures that we are doing here is exactly to document all these violations and challenges that people confront, and we are happy to work with the National Commission of Human Rights on this issue, and several other civil society organizations, a very vibrant human rights movement here in Indonesia, so we are glad to have them as well. But I will discuss a little bit about this law and what it does in terms of ensuring artistic freedom and to help artists to express their ideas and aspirations in better or in a more free environment. So the law itself is called Undang-Undang Pemajuan Kebudayaan, for the advancement of culture. Advancement is a very 1940s concept, but yes, it was, the cue was taken from the 1945 Constitution, so we use that as the title of the law. But the law basically helps to structure how culture here is organized, and the governance of culture. And it is organized around 4 basic concepts. First is protection of culture, and the second is development of culture. Third is the pemanfaatan, would be utilization of culture, and pembinaan, guidance, support, and all that. But I'm not going into the details, but one of the very important feature is about archiving, and this is very much related to copyright and all that. But not only for contemporary artists, we have a copyright law concerned to that, but the problem is that not every artist is very organized in keeping their records and all that, so we are helping and providing support for that as well. But also for traditional arts, and this is an area that is lacking, because in my office we have a documentation of not less than 90,000 cultural expressions from dances, food, etc., by these traditional communities. And there's little has been done to ensure that the utilization of these expressions are protected. So I give you an example, for example, herbal medicine and traditional knowledge around that. In Indonesia, art in the traditional community is not considered as a separate sphere of life. It's very much related to religion, the way of life, like daily way of life. So we tend to think not of artistic expression as a field on itself, but always related to different parts of life. But archiving and the ensuring of copyright is one of the features of this new law. And and then another part is about the need for education and also literacy, which I think very essential when it comes to making people understand about the necessity of artistic freedom. It is a challenge in the bureaucracy itself. I've been working for the government for 1.5 years, and I know that the challenge is very huge to make government officials especially understand that artistic freedom is not a luxury, but is a necessity, and basically you need it for the development, for the society to keep together and also to develop in the future. The last thing that I want to say related to this morning I was at a pitching forum with a friend from Index on Censorship here, organized by British Council, Ford Foundation, different groups, and brought together like a very